Well, Gandhi, of course, thought that his vision of non-violent resistance was a universal one. He didn't think it was specific to India. He only thought that India, because of her size, her international position, her population, and the role she played within the empire, within the British Empire, could play a kind of, how should I put it, could provide the precedent for a global dispersal of non-violent practices of resistance. So that was the thing that made India important in his eyes. Of course, he thought that Indian civilization had produced certain ways of thinking about the world and certain ways of practicing ethics non-violently that were important, or that could be important for the rest of the world. But he didn't think that somehow his practices were meant only for India. So they were universal. And in fact, it is arguable that Gandhi continues to be seen as an important figure more outside India than within it. That he is referred to by protest movements and struggles in many parts of the world. Now, this reference might not be a very deep reference often. It might be a superficial reference precisely because Gandhi has become a kind of global icon. And indeed, he was one of the earliest global icons. Right? In his time, from the early 20th century, he became an international star in a way that very few people had in the past. He was one of mass media's earliest icons, and he continues to be that. But in a kind of, as I put it, superficial way very often. So I'm sure President Obama is quite genuine and sincere when he refers to Gandhi as an influence, an inspiration. But he hasn't actually said anything very detailed or profound about Gandhi's role in the present. Well, how should I put it? I'm sure he will be very unhappy at certain things, but perhaps quite accepting of others. So, Gandhi in his own lifetime, before the partition of India, was used to dealing with a multi-party political system. There was more than one party. Of course, the Congress, for very good reasons, because of the anti-colonial struggle, claimed to represent all Indians. It wanted to unite them as part of the anti-colonial struggle. Though even then, even at that time, before independence, from time to time Gandhi did actually advocate, if not multi-party democracy after independence, certainly political pluralism in Indian society. Well, this is the thing. I mean, on the one hand, Gandhi seems to, towards the end of his life, come to some vision that you might call vaguely socialist. And in that way, he links to Nehru. On the other hand, Gandhi is also and had always been a strong proponent of private ownership of property, though held in trust, as you say, and of private enterprise. I mean, that's the background he himself comes from, right, as a member of a trading caste. So I think he would have been deeply unhappy at non-inclusive growth. And he would have been deeply unhappy at any move to, as it were, impoverish the countryside at the expense of the city, which is what he used to inveigh against during his own lifetime. On the other hand, I think that what you see happening in India today demographically is things don't always happen in the way people intend them to happen. So the latest figures tell us that migration to the big metropolitan cities is in fact decreasing. That there's out-migration, and that you in fact have movements between small towns or between villages. It's not the kind of thing, entirely the kind of thing that Gandhi disliked so much. The countryside is sucked out of, labor is sucked from the countryside, which is then further impoverished, and the labor itself is rather badly treated in the cities where it is required. So it's not a drain, from one thing to another of the kind that he criticized so harshly. So even in the midst of what has been remarkably unequal growth in India, after all, perhaps you might say it's been inevitable in its inequality. Nevertheless, it's not something that he would have liked, clearly. But as always in Indian society, there's always a countervailing tendency, despite people's best or worst intentions. And these kinds of population movements I've been talking about, who knows what they represent? But one thing that they certainly represent is a kind of popular shift away from what had been predicted as happening. The creation of enormous megacities, the depletion of the countryside, and all the consequences that followed. I'm not saying that, this small fact that I mentioned is a source of great hope. But the only thing that I think it should tell us is that things never work out, as I said, in the way that we often think that they should. And that too is something that Gandhi realized throughout his life. I mean, what he was really concerned with is the incalculable, what you cannot calculate, what you cannot instrumentalize, what you cannot predict. And in all those ways, of course, he was, in some sense, an anti-economic thinker. If the economy is all about predictability, calculability, and controllability, he realized that the aims of those 3 or 4 modes of behavior were never fully fulfilled, and that's where hope lay.